Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out here. I'm sure all of you have at some point heard the phrase, a giant amongst men. Well, today you get to witness a giant amongst men. S.Aijazuddin is one of the greatest contemporary art historians of Pakistan, a man that has authored over a dozen books, ranging from topics like art history, postcards, right down to diplomatic events such as Nixon's visit to China. It is said that being a historian is a difficult task. Being an art historian is an even more difficult task. But being an art historian in a country like Pakistan, well, that is a task that can only be done by one man. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, S.Aijazuddin.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much indeed, Huzaifa. When I received the program, I'd assumed that Huzaifa was a female. And I'm so glad that Huzaifa has in fact changed gender. So, welcome. And he's from Chitral, lives in Peshawar, and has a very large, extensive following on his blog. So I'm delighted and honored that you are here for this. The topic that we'll be talking about for the next 45 minutes or so, well, even less, because Huzaifa has his own presentation to make. It's on deltiology. Now, what is deltiology? It's the hobby of collecting postcards. And although it's a niche interest, there are a number of people in the United States, and I'd like to pay tribute to Umar Khan, who is in San Francisco, Dr. Ken Robbins, who's in Washington, then in India, there's Ratnesh, and Sangeeta Mathur, who have a very large collection of postcards. So there's a wide interest in them, and it's geographically spread. Now, my book, Forgotten Images of Postcards of Pre-Pakistan, 1890 to 47, is the latest addition to a number of books in this growing genre. Towards the middle, I'll just give you a very brief introduction to the history of these. Towards the middle of the 19th century, economics got the better of communications. Correspondents sought a cheaper means of conveying their messages other than in sealed letters. And a German, Heinrich von Stephan, proposed the introduction of a stiff form of envelope size, which could be written on directly without having to put it in an envelope. Therefore, for the postcard was basically a cost-cutting exercise, but perhaps the benefit was that it saved time in the work allotted to it. Before the telephone, it was the quickest, most readily form of communication, conveying a quick message. But quick, yes, but unlike a sealed letter, it was open to anyone to read. So secrecy forfeited itself for cost saving. The first postcard was introduced in Austria in 1869, followed a year later by Great Britain. Several million were posted in the first year. In India, it was started in 1879. By 1894, Britain had been allowed to issue postcards, and firms in Europe began to flood the market. Their popularity proved irresistible. So during their heyday, between 200 and 300 billion postcards were in circulation, had been sent either from the east to the west or vice versa. To modern collectors, the charm of these postcards are not so much the handwritten personal messages they conveyed, but the images they carried on their reverse. Scenery, the more spectacular the better. Monuments, the greater, grander the better. Events, the more contemporary the better. And people, the more picturesque the better. In fact, anything that would interest an addressee located often thousands of miles away from the sender. Over time, the handwritten postcard was overtaken by technology, and the hand that once scribbled swift messages now holds a mobile phone. It doesn't need to turn a page. Text and images are a handy encyclopedia of information are available at the tap of a finger. Although pictorial postcards are now history, their historicity remains. Although replaced, they provide us and future generations of Pakistanis with an invaluable record of buildings, landscapes, events, and people of a pre-Pakistan, the crucible from which we all came. When I talk about pre-Pakistan, I'm talking about an area, and forgive, I'm not getting involved in the politics of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, etc., I'm talking about geographical areas which now constitute Pakistan. So when I talk of pre-1940, pre-Pakistan, I'm talking about a time and a geography that was pre-independence. What would local postmen have looked like in those days? Well, on the left-hand side, you see a man, a postman in Huzaifa, and what is interesting about it is, rather like polio vaccination staff today, they needed an armed escort along with them. And on the right-hand side, you see a more traditional form of postman. The earliest post mark that we have is from what was called the Sindh Dak. And this was in 1852, and it was an impression on a letter. It wasn't a stamp which you licked, it was an impression in wax. And the earliest post office that we have in Pakistan was in 1866, which was in Karachi. So that is the time from which these things began. Now, not everybody was literate, and so you have persons using a letter writer, scribe, who was sitting in the market, and many of you must have seen them, particularly in the old city or outside the old city. The top one is a portrait which is a painting that was done by Edwin Lord Weeks. Edwin Lord Weeks was an American visitor who came here, a painter, and he did this painting of a letter writer. And for the women who certainly had no opportunity of being able to write themselves, they would then resort to this public form of public facility available. I'll now take you on a geographical tour, starting from Karachi, then we move to Sindh, then I'll take you to Lahore, and we move to the rest of the Punjab, all of these being, of course, provincial capitals. Then we move on to Peshawar and the rest of the KPK, and then Quetta and the rest of Balochistan, and I'll end with some, I hope, funny postcards for you. So let's begin with Karachi. Approaching Karachi, this is the kind of postcard that would have been sent, probably by somebody who had traveled on this ship back to their relatives in the United Kingdom. Many of you may be familiar with this, which was the famous Bandar, which used to extend into Clifton, and adjacent to it is now a property which belongs to one of the multi-billionaire real estate dealers, and it's under dispute at the moment. But this is what the place looked like before real estate moguls got into it. Frey Hall, before any of the buildings around it were built. So the Sindh Club, etc., nowhere to be seen. And this is the Frey Hall in 1900. The next one is Frey Hall in 1905, and by which time Queen Victoria's statue that you see on the left-hand side had been erected. So this was later removed, as was George V and various others, and taken to, I think, part of it is in Mohata Palace now. Holy Trinity Cathedral in Karachi, next to Hotel Metropole, and this was, as it was in its original state. When they discovered it was the tower was so tall that it looked like a giraffe, they then lopped off the top and reduced it to 3 stories instead of 4. But the 4th was quite intentional because what wanted to do was to use it as a kind of lighthouse, even from the center of Karachi. Empress Market, as it was, and then it was encroached upon, and now that it's been cleaned up, this is what it is like today. So very similar to what the position was in 1903. Bandar Road, one of the more popular thoroughfares in Karachi, and we have a number of people here who are nostalgic, despite having lived in Lahore for a number of years. Amina, am I right? She and my wife were both from Karachi, and they still hanker and they regard it as an imposition to have to live in Lahore. But this is what your street, Bandar Road, was like. And in those days, they had tram lines and Victoria carriages, horse-drawn, which explains why every evening Karachi streets were washed with water to make sure that there was no manure left lying around. KMC building, under construction at the time, in 1928. It's now complete, but these are important because they show what they look like even under construction. The Hindu Gymkhana, now the National Academy of Performing Arts, And this was to cater for the Hindus, who at that time was a sizable population in Karachi. So you had the Hindu Gymkhana, and just to show you that we have no religious bias as such, I'm going to include some pictures of the Hindu temple, which is at Manora, and one of the devotees who would have been attending. Now, it's interesting that today there are no Hindu temples extant in Lahore, but when there is Navaratri, etc., and you go to the Ravi River, you'll find many of them congregating there as such, which is a good sign. It's a good sign. Mangupir Shrine, outside Karachi. This is famous for, as a tribute to Pir Mango, who was supposed to have shaken his hair and out fell lice, and the lice were then converted into alligators. So they are sacred alligators, but attributed to Pir Mango. Let me show you an interesting one, which is the hangar for R101. R101 was an airship filled with gas, okay, a bit like our National Assembly in Islamabad, filled with gas, inflammable, and the idea was that this airship could travel from, it was planned, from Paris to Karachi. And it had accommodation on board, you could eat there, and it had sofas and sleeping arrangements, etc. Unfortunately, because it was filled with gas, it was inflammable, and so on its maiden voyage, the R101 burnt at Paris, and so we had no need for the hangar anymore, and so that was dismantled and then sold for its metal. Karachi Racecourse, 1906. At that time in the center, rather like in Lahore, we had what's now the Jilani Park, was the Royal Racecourse. Ours was shifted, as was this one. But just to tell you that our history began in a rather traumatic way. That racecourse in 1947 was then used to accommodate refugees. And I remember as a child, and this probably gives my age away, as a child, seeing the cortege of Quaid-e-Azam going down Victoria Road, what's now Abdullah Haroon Road, going down and pulled by Navy seamen. And us scattering flowers, we were scattering flowers from our balconies. And this was at what was called the Paradise Corner. The next day, I went with my mother and we visited the grave of Quaid-e-Azam, a Bikachiti that had flowers on it. But as we came out of our flat, which was on Victoria Road, I had to walk over, and I still remember this, walk over bodies of sleeping individuals. And they were muhajirs. So they had nowhere else to stay. And so they were sleeping on Victoria Road, all the way up hither to, there was 18 Victoria Road, all the way, because there was nowhere else for them to sleep. So when you consider today, Karachi is a vast metropolis. I mean, you start driving from one end and it takes you a couple of hours to reach the other. We've come a long way since then, and we should be proud of that. We should be proud of it. Now I'll take you to Sindh. So let's begin. I've shown you the capital, and let's begin with the Fuleli Canal outside Hyderabad. And you can see some of the old vessels which used to be used, and the tombs of the Amirs of Hyderabad, of Sindh. A number of them distinctive. I won't bore you with their names, but this was a kind of postcard which had been sent from Hyderabad to persons abroad to show where this person had been posted. The Miani Monument, a symbol, embarrassing, but a symbol of our defeat by the British under Sir Charles Napier. Sir Charles Napier erected this monument in 1843, and then subsequently he was posted to the Punjab, and he was responsible for the creation of the Lahore Cantonment. So when you go to the Lahore Cantonment, you go to the Girja Chowk, there'll be a small monument there in a little garden, triangular garden, and that shows where Napier stopped his horse and decided that this was going to be the cantonment of Lahore. Victoria Tower, celebrate Victoria. She wanted her name propagated as much as possible. All her sons had to have the name Albert, all her daughters had to name Victoria, and grandchildren, and of course everywhere in the empire, Victoria was the name that applied. Here, this was a tower that was built in Jacobabad. And Going into proto-history, we have Mohenjo-daro, and the reason this photograph was posed was because we wanted to put people in there to show the scale of the streets of Mohenjo-daro as to how advanced they were when it came to urban planning. The minaret of Miran Shah in Sakkar on one side of the river, and on the other side, Sadbela, which is now a combination of Hindu temples and Muslim shrines. And this is in the middle of this Indus River between Sakkar and Rodi. And if you want to know what Sindhis looked like in those days, well, this is a picture of Sindhi merchants, and they were wearing turbans, or rather a hat, which is distinctly Sindhi, and it was called Sarai Ki Topi. Let's leave Sindh now and go to what was at that time a Riyasat, which is Khairpur, and this would be the palace of the Mir of Khairpur. As you know, subsequently in the 1950s, Khairpur was merged into Pakistan, as was Bahawalpur. And this picture, I don't have any pictures of Bahawalpur, but this one is very revealing, because what it shows is the first Bahawalpur inventory, 1834 to 1934, 100 years, as they put it, of service to the British Raj. And when I asked one of the Abbasi family, I said, "Yar, have you ever seen this?" And 100 years of servitude to the British. His reply to me was, "How do you think we survived?" So, Multan, I'm now moving up country. And here is 2 or 3 interesting pictures of Multan, Rukn-e-Alam's tomb, of course. But what I found fascinating was this carriage train that was in front, not drawn by horses or by elephants or camels, but by bell. Now I'll come to the city we all love, and that's Lahore. Welcome. And we're having a high time in Lahore. Well, there were good old days then. Chief's College. Anybody here went to Chief's College? Aha! Okay, right. Well, it was only called Chief's College for about 3 months after it was inaugurated. After that, it became Aitchison College. They had to turn it to the British, so after Sir Charles Aitchison. But it was still known as Chief's College. Designed by Swinton Jacob on the outer building, and inside by Lockwood Kipling and Bhairam Singh Mistry. At that time, I think initially there were about 170 pupils in all, and I was startled. I was the principal for some years, and I was startled to discover day before yesterday when I went to the Founders' Day exhibition that there are now 3,500 students there. And I remember when I was principal and we had 2,000, and we increased it by 200, and they said, "Oh my God, you're going to ruin the college." So now we've got 3,500 and probably still mounting. Another monument, Anarkali's tomb. Anarkali's tomb, one of the oldest monuments still in use in Lahore, and Anarkali's tomb was built, so it was said, by Jahangir in honor of his mistress, Anarkali. She was a dancing girl, but this story doesn't hold credence because dancing girls were expected to service the crown princes. There's nothing strange about that. And while she may have been ambitious, but why, entomb her alive simply because she was making a pass at the crown prince, the Waliad? So Sham Benegal, the film producer who passed away recently, he made a very interesting observation. He said, I think that she was not Jahangir's mistress. She was Akbar's younger wife, one of his younger wives. Because when Finch in 1618 travels from Lahore, he then notices the tomb of Imam Quel, as he calls her, under construction. And he describes her as one of Akbar's wives. And of course, we as historians thought, no, it can't be true. I mean, he's got it all wrong. But in fact, he got it right. Because there's no other explanation for such a severe form of punishment for a woman than the one that was meted out to her. I've got a very funny story, and I hope you don't mind my boring you with it. When my wife and I were constructing our house in Lahore, the contractor was taking forever. What should have taken 6 months was taking him a year, 2 years. So eventually I got fed up and I said, Sheikh Sahab, you know, this story about Anarkali being entombed alive is all rubbish. Didn't happen. And he said, no, you're a historian, you've written books on Lahore. No, but why didn't it happen? I said, Sheikh Sahab, she wasn't entombed alive. She died of old age, waiting for a contractor like you to finish the job. Badshahi Mosque, one of the glories of Lahore, but I've introduced this one because I wanted to show you another, which is where a local publisher would have used the same image, but overprinted it with Eid greetings. So this I wanted to show you as an example of how an original picture would be taken and then superimposed according to what was the demand for that particular season. Wazir Khan's Mosque, Glory of Lahore, called by Lockwood Kipling a University of Design. And you can see here in the foreground what's now been cleared, right, as an area for public entertainment. And if you wanted to travel around Lahore, these were the kind of buggies or hackney carriages that you would have used. The top one was second class, and the bottom one was third class. As you can see, it was air conditioned. The top one, it would cost you 6 annas in those days per hour, and 3 annas for any extended hour that you used it. And the church that you see in the back is the church that is just behind the State Bank building. And you'll see this in this particular picture of, these are French women, French nuns, who were sent out to establish a convent here. And what I liked about this picture was that you could see the nuns in a belgadi. That was the form of transport that they had to come to the Punjab. It's the Franciscan Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart. Lahore Cathedral. Originally, Anarkali's tomb was the first cathedral of Lahore, and then when it was vacated, this was built by Sir Gilbert Scott, according to the design of Gilbert Scott. Then this Anarkali's tomb became the repository for the archives, and this became the first cathedral of Lahore. Punjab High Court. It was, when you go there, and if you have been there more often than you probably want to remember, if you go there and look very carefully at the roof, you'll find symbols of every religion on the roof. And it was done deliberately to show that the law was above all religion, and that was common to all religions. And so I discovered this when I was, in fact, researching for the anniversary of the Lahore High Court, that this was one of the symbols that was incorporated in the Lahore High Court building. Next to the Lahore High Court was a statue of Sir John Lawrence. Sir John Lawrence was the first Governor General here after the annexation of the Punjab in 1849. And to commemorate his stay here, this statue was erected, which showed him with a sword in one hand and a pen in the other. And it said that, who will you be ruled by? The pen or the sword? Meaning by the law or by the military? And we all know what the answer to that was. View from the Fort Complex. Fort Complex in Lahore, looking at the barracks that were built by the British, and the Alamgiri Gate, the formal entrance into the Lahore Fort. And here we have Queen Victoria's statue, which used to be on the at the Charing Cross Junction. And I remember asking Shoaib Hashmi, well, I said, which direction was she facing in? He said, "Hai koi sawal hai kya? Oh, main te odi godi vich palya. Te mainu te pata hai. Main kya kede paase? Governor's house or the mall?" And he said, "Oh, yaar, mall." So I said, in which case, why was Queen's Road the one in front? The road in front. So you see, human memory can be faulty. Queen Victoria's statue was then removed. They got fed up. They put a garland of shoes around her, and Sikh Transit Gloria, Sikh Transit Victoria. And she was then transported on a Gada Gadi, or Belgadi, to the museum where it is still visible today. Now I'll take you quickly to Rawalpindi, and let's look at, in Rawalpindi, the Najghar, which was meant Naachne ke liye, it was a club, and it's now become the Army Club. Next, a statue of Queen Victoria, which was then, its arms were removed, broken, and it is now in the forecourt of the British High Commission. So when the Queen came here in 1997, I happened to give her a book which I'd written, in which I'd called The Armless Queen. And it was about Benazir Bhutto. And because I described Benazir as being the armless queen in her first government, she would walk around like this, chadar oढ़ ke. So the Queen looked at the book and she then turned to the High Commissioner and she said, never put arms on that statue. So he said, why, ma'am? And she said, because you'll destroy the title of his book, won't you? So this was the kind of humor that she had. Murray, let's move northwards. Early picture of Murray. The early bazaar was the lower tope, not the upper. When there was a fire, then they shifted the shops to the upper story near the church. So what you see today as the Mall in Murray was in fact the lower one. Let's move now. Holy Trinity Church with surmounted Murray. And now let me take you to Peshawar and KPK. In this, Pathans. And it was a novelty, so the person from Peshawar would be sending images of Pathans. And the Kisa Khani Bazaar in Peshawar, famous. And fur traders who were piling stuff which had been brought to them and then were going to be exported. Islamia College, visited by Quaid-e-Azam. And a Roman Catholic church. Now, the reason it was designed as a mosque was because many of the converts were Muslims. And so to make them feel at home, the church was modeled to look like a mosque. Jamrud Fort, belonging to the Sikhs, which was then appropriated, taken over. And the Khyber Pass, famous Khyber Pass with an endless train of caravans. And here, something which remained then and is still in existence today, it's absolutely forbidden to cross this border into Afghan territory, as if this man is going to be able to stop anybody, Taliban or otherwise, from crossing. Here, a lovely picture of Pathan women. Unusual, but because we're Pathan women, you can't have women without somebody peering in, wanting to have a quick look at them. Quetta and Balochistan. Some of the earliest pictures, and these are important because there was an earthquake in 1935 and it destroyed many of the buildings. So these are of historical importance. The Sandeman Hall, totally destroyed. And this was what the railway station would have looked like after the destruction caused by the earthquake. Staff College, this is the old building. Shanaz and I, my wife and I, went to see it and expecting to see this, and we saw a ramp, spanking new building. And I said, what happened to it? He said, wo purani ho gayi si na, so we had to destroy it. I said, yeah, what nature couldn't do, you did. So, and here, fruit sellers in Quetta, Balochi Brohis, and the famous Kodak Tunnel, which was 2.5 miles long. Now, very quickly to Chitral, an image of the fort at Chitral, which showed the fort, which was relieved by a young husband in 1894, and you can see here overprinted with Christmas greetings and best wishes. Now I'm going to end, because today is the last session of the LLF, for this hall anyway, and also I think for the others. So let's have a bit of fun. So let's look at the social ones, and these, very briefly, Nestle's at the time. And this is now 1900, so it's an ad for Nestle's, but of course you couldn't publish, you couldn't sell milk without the army, so there had to be the forces. And a thing called Cerebellus tonic, but to show you that it was unisex, the woman is sitting behind him. And another user of that tonic, who probably had gone high on it, and Roses of the Punjab. But the man who printed it wrote underneath, Roses of the Punjab, I don't think. And here, there are going to be two images of dancing girls. This is a Goharjan in Quetta and Goharjan in Karachi. It was a very popular name. And she was one of the most famous of the singers and the first who had recorded her voice on a playback, on a record. 78 jo purane zamane mein 78 hote the. Here, it was described as a Mohammedan beggar from KPK. But you can see that he's overloaded with medals. And it's a forerunner, and I was tempted to put a picture of somebody modern with a lot of medals. So, resisting that temptation, I used a North Korean model. Now, any similarity with modern, purely coincidental. Now let's move. And this is a man who was taking things easy. His foot had the string, and so he would keep pulling at the pankha, which was on the other side of the wall. Let me end with a rather doleful picture, and that is that the funeral of Quaid-e-Azam. We're now just beyond the 47 category date that I is imposed on myself, but I included this for a particular reason. It shows Quaid-e-Azam's cortege, and in the foreground, Navy, Army, and various political personalities, and poor Fatma Jinnah is in the corner, here. Right, compressed. But he was, as we all know, he was transported on a Navy gun carriage, not on this. But perhaps Quaid-e-Azam knew something we didn't know, which was in the future you'd be ruled by the sword, not by the pen. So let me end with that, and thank you for your attention. So, therefore,
So, sir, we saw that most of the local monuments were pictures that were taken by local people in the sense who were colonizers but born over here, raised over here. Doesn't that mean that there was a section of British people who were born and raised in British India who had the same affection for this land as we do today?
Yes, of course there were. You've got people like the wife of Johnson, Boris Johnson. She was Sikh. Her mother was born here, and she was Sikh by origin. So yes, we reached the Prime Minister's house in 10 Downing Street. Yes, there were. There was a whole family of people, not just Anglo-Indians, meaning who had married British officers, but English people who were close to this. Please, yeah.
Another question that I wanted to ask was that as we see monuments around the world, they're not surrounded by buildings. And as we saw today, the monuments that are present in Pakistan were also not originally surrounded by buildings. So what exactly led to this encroachment where every single public monument in Pakistan is completely engulfed by this sea of buildings that completely surround them?
I think you can ask the KDA, LDA, DHA. They're the ones who are responsible for this. It's the population explosion. Today, when we're talking about this, we're talking about 20 million people. Today, we have 250 million people. In another 30 years, we're going to have 350 million people. So encroachment is inevitable.
It was an honor for me to be here and for me to moderate S.Aijazuddin's book. It was an honor for me. Thank you so much.